40 minutes, she whispered, her fingers cold and tight around my wrist. Please, just pretend to be my husband. I caught the scent of bergamot in her perfume, heard the jazz blur into the background noise of 100 conversations, and out of the corner of my eye I saw a small flash of light near the far wall, like someone's phone screen switching on and off again. I did not know this woman well enough to be holding her hand like that. I nodded anyway, before I even thought to ask her why. My name is Ethan Cole. I am 36 years old, and I build things for a living, or I rebuild them, which in my line of work amounts to nearly the same thing. I restore old houses in Charleston, South Carolina, the kind with crown molding nobody makes anymore, and floorboards that remember every footstep that ever crossed them. I live alone in a brick house near the harbor that I fixed up with my own 2 hands, one stubborn hinge at a time, one Saturday at a time. There is a particular kind of peace in that kind of work. Nobody interrupts you when you are alone with a screwdriver and a door that refuses to close right. Nobody asks you to explain yourself. 3 years ago, I got divorced. Her name was Rachel, and she was the kind of person who needed a room to notice her the second she walked into it. I was never built that way. I needed a quiet drafting table, a black coffee, and maybe 6 hours where nobody asked anything of me at all. Near the end, she told me I was flat, that there was nothing underneath the surface worth digging for. I did not argue with her about it. Some accusations you learn to carry quietly because fighting them costs more than they are worth, and because some small part of you is always afraid they might be true. 6 months before the night I am about to tell you about, I signed a contract to redesign the new headquarters for Hale Properties, a real estate company that had been passed down through one family for 3 generations. That family was down to a single person by then, a woman named Vivian Hale, 31 years old, and the first time I met her, I remember thinking she looked like she was running arithmetic behind her eyes that had nothing to do with square footage. Calm, quiet, watching everything twice before she ever said a word about it. I asked her something during that first meeting that I still do not entirely know why I asked. I was looking over her blueprints and I said, "Do you want to live in this space, or do you just want to display it?" She went quiet for a long moment before answering, longer than the question seemed to warrant, and something about that silence stayed with me far longer than it should have. 2 months before the party, Rachel joined Hale Properties as a communications consultant. I will admit it rattled me. I asked her, half joking, if this was some kind of coincidence, and she just smiled that easy smile of hers and said, "Don't worry, Ethan. I won't tell anyone we used to be married. Stay professional." I believed her, mostly because I wanted to, because believing the easy version of things has always been a habit I never fully managed to break. But there was something in the way she looked at Vivian, even in those first weeks, that I chose not to examine too closely at the time. The night of the party was a fundraiser tied to a major investment, and the man holding the checkbook was a silver-haired investor named Whitfield, who had told Vivian plainly, long before any of this began, that he did not put his money into companies run by women with unstable personal lives. He never apologized for saying it. In his mind, it was simply a condition of doing business, one he expected everyone around him to understand without further discussion. The ballroom smelled like old oak and expensive candle wax. Glasses clinked somewhere behind me in a rhythm I could not quite place. Overhead, a chandelier threw broken, shifting light across a marble floor polished so well it looked like still water. And across the room, early in the evening, I saw Rachel laughing easily with Whitfield, a little too easily for my comfort, and I could not explain, even to myself, why that put a small, cold stone of unease somewhere in my chest. I am not good at parties like this one, and I have never pretended otherwise. I straightened my tie in a hallway mirror and told myself something close to the truth. I am better at listening to a floorboard creak than I am at listening to a room full of people laugh at things that are not particularly funny. Vivian found me about 20 minutes into the evening, standing near a column at the edge of the room, half hidden from the worst of the noise. That is when her hand closed around my wrist, and she asked me, in a low, urgent voice, to be her husband for 40 minutes. I want to be honest about what I understood in that moment, which was almost nothing. What she told me in that first breathless rush of explanation was simple enough on its surface. Whitfield would only sign with a stable family, that had always been his condition, and she needed the board watching from across the room to see her as something other than a lonely woman running a company alone, vulnerable to whoever decided to circle her next. I said yes before I had fully processed what she was actually asking of me. There is a version of that decision that makes me sound braver or steadier than I really was. The truth is simpler than that. Something in her voice made refusing feel almost impossible, like turning down a person who was already halfway underwater. For the next 40 minutes, I played a part I had never once rehearsed. I put my hand at the small of her back the way I imagined a husband of several years might, easy and unthinking. I refilled her wine without being asked to. I called her honey once, clumsily, and felt my own ears go warm at the sound of it leaving my mouth in front of strangers. And the strange thing, the thing I did not expect at all, was how little any of it felt like acting. Vivian knew things about me that a woman meeting a contractor for a straightforward business relationship should never have known. She knew I took my coffee black, no sugar, no cream, no exceptions. She knew I had scrapped an entire early draft of the headquarters design because I refused to cut down the old oak tree standing at the edge of the lot. When I asked her, half laughing, how exactly she knew all of that, she looked briefly caught, almost embarrassed, before she said, I read the file on the man I hired very carefully. It came out as a joke, the kind of line you use to smooth over a slip you did not mean to make, but her eyes did not match the lightness in her voice, not even close. Halfway through the evening, a small silver pocket watch slipped loose from her handbag and landed near the toe of my shoe. I bent down and picked it up before she could reach it herself. There was an inscription worn soft into the case from years of handling. 40 minutes can change everything, it read. I looked up at her, waiting for some kind of explanation, and she only offered me a sad, private kind of smile. It was my grandfather's, she said quietly. He was right about almost everything in this life, except how to actually say the things that mattered most. I did not push her on it. Some things, I have learned, are not yours to pry open before someone is truly ready to hand them to you on their own terms. I remember, oddly, the weight of that little watch in my palm before I handed it back to her. Heavier than a piece of metal that size had any right to be. There was something about holding it, even for those few seconds, that made me feel like I had been trusted with a piece of her that most people in that room would never come close to seeing. I did not know, standing there under all that chandelier light, that I would spend the following weeks thinking about that weight more than I thought about almost anything else in my ordinary, unremarkable life. I noticed Rachel circle past us twice over the course of that evening. The first time, it was nothing, just a polite smile thrown in our general direction. The kind of smile you offer people at a party you are obligated to attend and would rather not be at. The second time, though, I saw her lingering a little too long near one of the catering staff, a young man holding his phone at an angle that had nothing to do with photographing the appetizers on the tray beside him. I filed the image away without understanding, in that moment, why any part of me thought it mattered. At one point, Rachel drifted close enough to speak directly to Vivian, her voice pitched just low enough to sound private, and just loud enough for me to catch every single word of it. Ethan plays the devoted husband well, she said, smiling the entire time she said it. I would know. I used to be the proof. Vivian did not answer her. She did not raise her voice, did not flinch, did not give Rachel the reaction she was so clearly fishing for. She simply reached over and squeezed my hand, once, quietly, a gesture so small it would have meant absolutely nothing to anyone watching us from across the room. But to me, standing right beside her, it felt like being steadied, like being told, without a single spoken word, that I did not need to defend either of us against anything at all. Near the end of the 40 minutes, Whitfield approached the two of us, shook my hand with the firm, satisfied grip of a man closing a deal he had already decided upon in his own mind, and told Vivian he would sign the contract first thing in the morning. He seemed genuinely pleased, almost relieved, as though some private worry of his had been quietly resolved just by watching the two of us stand together for less than an hour. Looking back on it now, I understand how strange that should have felt to me in the moment, how strange it should feel to anyone that a grown man with that much money at his disposal would base a decision of that size on the simple sight of two people standing close together at a party, sharing a glass of wine, exchanging small, ordinary gestures. But watching his face soften as he shook my hand, I understood, at least a little, that Whitfield was not really looking at a contract at all. He was looking for some kind of proof that the world still contained people who meant the things they showed on the outside. And for those 40 minutes, without either of us fully realizing it, we had accidentally given him exactly that. When the 40 minutes were finally, officially up, I started to let go of her hand the way you release a prop once a scene is ended. She held on a few seconds longer than she strictly needed to. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not asking why." I drove home that night replaying the whole evening in a way that had very little to do with the contract, or with Whitfield, or with the simple relief of watching a deal get signed. I kept thinking about the way her hand had felt in mine the moment Rachel made her comment, steady and certain, in a way that did not feel like performance at all. I kept thinking about the pocket watch, about the sadness underneath her brief explanation of it, about the fact that a woman who ran a company with the same precision she seemed to run her own expression had let something slip in front of me that she had clearly meant to keep hidden from everyone, including herself. I told myself it was nothing. I have always been remarkably good at telling myself things that were not quite true, but I could not stop wondering, even then, driving home through empty streets, whether those 40 minutes had been about the contract at all, or whether the contract had simply been the excuse a careful, guarded woman gave herself to stand close to someone for exactly as long as she allowed herself to want it, and not 1 minute longer. I sat in my driveway for a long time that night before I finally went inside, engine off, hands still on the wheel, running the whole evening back through my mind like a film reel I could not quite stop watching. I thought about Rachel and the years we had spent failing to understand each other. I thought about how easy it had felt, standing beside Vivian for those 40 minutes, to be exactly the kind of person I had always secretly hoped I was underneath everything. And I thought, more than anything, about the way she had thanked me for not asking why, as though the not asking had been its own kind of gift, one I had given her without even realizing it. And somewhere in the back of my mind, quieter than that question but no less persistent, sat the image of Rachel lingering near that young man with his phone, an image whose real weight I would not understand until several weeks later. 3 weeks passed before the quiet fell apart completely. I kept working with Hale Properties through that stretch, and Vivian and I found ourselves sharing lunch more often than the project strictly required, quiet meals where neither of us said very much of anything, and yet somehow those silences felt warmer to me than most conversations I had had in years. Then Rachel released the video. She had hired that same young man from the party, the one with the phone I had noticed but not understood, to film the two of us without either of us ever knowing. What she released to the press, and directly to the Hale Properties board, was not the honest 40 minutes I remembered living through. It had been cut and reassembled. Small gestures stretched and stitched together until they suggested something else entirely, something illicit, something calculated in advance. Alongside the video came messages neither of us had ever written and a fabricated meeting log dated weeks before the actual contract was signed, implying that Vivian and I had been secretly involved long before Whitfield ever put his name to anything at all. The insinuation was plain enough for anyone reading between the lines. Whitfield had been deceived into investing in a lie dressed up as stability. Rachel sent the entire package to local reporters and directly to the Hale Properties Board of Directors, timed, I would later learn, with the same careful precision she once used to plan surprise parties I had never particularly wanted. I found out about all of it the way most people find out their life is about to change, which is to say badly, and secondhand, through a phone call from a colleague who asked me, in a careful, cautious voice, whether I had seen what was circulating online yet. I remember sitting at my own kitchen table, watching the video for the first time, watching myself say things I recognized and yet did not recognize at all, stitched together in an order that made 40 honest minutes look like something calculated and cold. It is a strange thing, watching yourself become a stranger in footage of a night you actually lived through. I confronted her myself, in a hallway just outside her office, my voice lower than I felt inside. "You still haven't let go of turning everything into a performance, have you?" I said. She did not even blink at that. "At least this time I saw it coming, Ethan," she said. "You always did go looking for a powerful woman to lean on." It was a cruel thing to say, made worse by the fact that some old, tired part of me was afraid it might contain a grain of truth. I stood there in that hallway for a long moment after she walked away, replaying our marriage in fast, disjointed pieces, trying to figure out at what point exactly she had decided that hurting me was worth more to her than anything we might have once had together. I never found a clean answer. Some people, I think, simply enjoy holding a knife more than they enjoy putting it down, even long after the war that justified picking it up in the first place has ended. Vivian stood in front of the board herself 2 days later. I was not in the room, but I heard about it afterward, piece by piece, the way you hear about a storm from someone who had been standing directly underneath it when it broke. She did not deny the 40 minutes. She could not without lying outright, and something stubborn in her refused to do that even with everything on the line. She admitted, in front of every director seated at that table, that she had asked me to stand beside her that night because she had not wanted to face Whitfield alone. It was the truth, offered up plainly and without flinching, and it cost her exactly as much as you would expect the truth to cost in a room full of people already looking for a reason to doubt her. Whitfield, invoking the very condition he had stated from the very beginning, threatened to pull his investment entirely. A scandal like this one, deception dressed up as stability, was precisely the kind of instability his so-called morality clause had existed to prevent in the first place. Vivian was left standing between two doors. Behind one was the contract, saved simply by denying everything, by calling the video a lie, and letting Rachel's fabrication quietly do the rest of the work for her. Behind the other door was the truth, and me, and whatever was left of both of us once the dust finally settled. I remember hearing that she held that little silver pocket watch through the entire emergency meeting that followed, her thumb moving over the worn inscription again and again, as if it were the only steady, solid thing left in the room. Someone who was there told me later that the room had gone completely silent when she said it, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses down on your chest even secondhand. Nobody on that board had expected her to admit anything at all. They had expected denial, lawyers, a carefully worded statement drafted by someone paid to make problems disappear quietly. Instead, they got a woman standing perfectly still, refusing to lie even when lying would have cost her almost nothing, and told her the entire truth would cost her everything. I will admit something here, plainly, because there is no good reason to dress it up. I was afraid that I had become, once again, the reason a woman I cared about was about to lose everything she had spent her whole life building. I had lived through that exact fear once before, with Rachel, in a much smaller and quieter way, and I did not know if I could survive watching it happen a second time, this time to someone who had done nothing wrong except let herself want something honest, for 40 uninterrupted minutes. "You think I'm scared of losing the contract," Vivian said to the board, her voice not shaking at all, not once, according to everyone who was there. "I'm scared of losing the one person who never once asked me to perform for him." I heard that line secondhand, from a junior associate who repeated it back to me almost reverently, and something in my chest cracked wide open when I finally heard it, not because it was dramatic, but because I knew, in that exact moment, that it was true, and that she had said it out loud in a room full of people who had every power in the world to destroy her for saying it. The board did not vote that day. Whitfield did not withdraw that day either, though nearly everyone in that room had quietly expected him to. Instead, he asked for time, and left without another word, carrying his silence out of the room with him like a verdict that had not yet finished being written. I went home that night, and sat in my kitchen with the lights off for far longer than I care to admit, turning the whole thing over and over in my mind, trying and failing to find some version of events where I had not been the one who lit this particular fire. Even by accident, even by simply agreeing to hold someone's hand for 40 minutes at a party I almost did not attend. I did not sleep much that night, or the 2 nights after it. I kept thinking about Vivian standing alone in front of that board, telling the truth because some part of her refused to do anything else, and I kept wondering whether the honest thing left for me to do was to step back quietly and let her fix this without me tangled up in the middle of it, or whether stepping back was simply another word for running, the same thing I had spent 3 years quietly doing since my marriage ended. Vivian called me late that same week and asked me to come to her office after hours, once everyone else had already gone home for the night. I remember the building was almost entirely dark, except for the lights spilling out from underneath her door, and I remember thinking, walking down that long, empty hallway, that I genuinely had no idea what I was about to hear on the other side of it. I found her sitting behind her desk, not in her chair of authority, but in the low guest seat across from it, like she had wanted, for once, it to meet me on equal footing, instead of from behind something that separated us. There were no papers spread out in front of her, no laptop open, nothing of the careful, composed CEO I had come to know over 6 months of meetings, just her, and the small lamp on the corner of her desk, and the quiet. She told me the truth that night, all of it, without flinching once. Whitfield was not the only reason, she said. She had noticed me long before the party, all the way back at our very first meeting, when I had asked her that question about whether she wanted to live in the space or simply display it to people who would never actually live in it themselves. Nobody had ever asked her something like that before, she told me. Not in 31 years. Not once. Not even the people who had known her since she was a child. She said the question had lodged itself somewhere in her and had never quite worked its way loose again. The pocket watch, she explained, had belonged to her grandfather, the only person in her entire life who had ever told her that sometimes 40 honest minutes were worth more than an entire lifetime spent performing for other people. She had carried it with her every single day since he died, waiting, she admitted, for a moment she felt was genuinely worthy of what he had spent his life trying to teach her. The night of the party, standing beside me while Rachel circled us both like something patient and hungry, she had decided, almost without meaning to decide anything at all, that this was finally that moment. I sat there listening to her, and I thought about my own grandfather, a man who never once said anything half as poetic in his entire life, and I understood, in a way I had not before, that everyone carries some small inherited instruction about how love is supposed to work, whether they know it consciously or not. Hers had come from a pocket watch and 8 quiet words. Mine, I realized, had mostly come from watching a marriage fall apart and deciding, wrongly, that safety meant staying small and asking for nothing. She admitted, quietly and without excuses, that she had used the situation with Whitfield as a kind of shelter, a reasonable, defensible excuse that let her stand close to me for 40 uninterrupted minutes without ever once having to explain what she actually felt underneath it. I told her the truth in return because it seemed only fair by then. I told her that since that night, I had not been able to stop thinking about the way her hand had felt in mine the moment Rachel made her comment about being the proof. It had not felt like acting, not for 1 second. It had felt like being chosen, quietly and completely, by someone who did not need to say a single word about it out loud. I told her, too, about the 3 years I had spent believing I was simply too quiet a man for anyone to build a life around, and how strange it felt to sit across from her now and realize that the very thing Rachel had once called flat, Vivian seemed to have been looking for the entire time. She listened without interrupting, the way she listened to everything, like every word mattered enough to be kept. That same evening, before either of us had fully finished talking, Whitfield called her directly, his voice unexpectedly gentle over the phone line. "I do not invest in manufactured perfection," he told her plainly. "I invest in people willing to stand in front of a room full of directors and admit, out loud, that they were wrong about something. My condition still stands," he said, "because you have proven exactly the kind of stability I was always looking for, just not in the shape I originally expected it to take." I asked Vivian, standing there with her in that dark, quiet office, whether she wanted to try doing this without the performance attached to it. No contract behind it this time, no 40-minute limit ticking away somewhere in the back of our minds, just something slow and real and entirely, without anyone watching to judge whether it looked convincing enough. She reached into her bag and pulled out the pocket watch, pressing it firmly into my open palm, closing my fingers around it herself with both of her hands. "Keep it," she said. "Next time I need 40 minutes, I want it to be real from the very first second, not the 40th. I stood there in that quiet office for a long moment afterward, the watch warm now from both our hands, and I understood that something had shifted permanently between us, something that had nothing to do with contracts or boards, or a man named Whitfield deciding whether we looked stable enough on paper. It was simply the two of us finally, without an audience. 3 months passed, and something quiet and lasting took root between us. We started meeting regularly, mornings at a small coffee shop near the harbor, where nobody recognized either of us, evenings where she would sit and simply watch me sketch at my drafting table without either of us needing to fill the silence with anything at all. There was no announcement, no grand declaration, just a slow accumulation of ordinary hours that somehow felt more significant, more permanent than anything either of us had bothered to say out loud. I noticed small things changing in her during that stretch, the kind of things you only catch if you are paying close attention. She stopped checking her phone every few minutes the way she used to during our early meetings. She laughed more easily and more often at things that were not actually all that funny, just because she felt like laughing. Once, on a Tuesday morning that meant nothing in particular, she showed up at my house unannounced with 2 coffees, sat down on the porch steps beside me, and said nothing at all for almost 20 minutes. Just watched the harbor with me in a silence that felt less like the absence of words and more like their own kind of language. I found myself, during those months, slowly setting down a weight I had been carrying since the divorce, without ever quite admitting it was there. I had spent 3 years believing that I was simply a quiet, unremarkable man who had failed to be enough for someone louder and brighter than I was. Vivian never once made me feel that way. If anything, she seemed to seek out the quiet in me the way you seek out shade on a hot day, like it was a relief rather than a flaw. During that same stretch, the legal team at Hale Properties discovered that the meeting log Rachel had circulated was entirely fabricated from beginning to end, a clear and provable violation, unlike the video itself, which had only ever been misleading rather than technically illegal. Rachel was terminated immediately, facing the very real possibility of a lawsuit over what she had knowingly manufactured. Vivian did not seek any kind of revenge, even though she had every right to. She simply let Rachel walk away quietly, and I think that quietness, more than anything either of us could have said out loud, marked the real, lasting difference between the two women. I heard, through the same junior associate who had once repeated Vivian's words to me from the board meeting, that Rachel left the building that final day without saying goodbye to anyone, carrying a single cardboard box down an elevator she had once ridden with the easy confidence of someone who believed she belonged there permanently. I felt no satisfaction hearing it, only a kind of tired sadness for the person she used to be before she decided that winning mattered more than being honest. 6 months after the party, the new Hale Properties headquarters was finally finished. I designed a small corner in Vivian's office myself, a quiet, deliberate space where the silver pocket watch now sat, inside a glass case, a small, unspoken reminder of everything that had led the two of us there. She never asked me to build it. I simply knew, somehow, that it needed a permanent home, somewhere it could be looked at without ever again having to be explained. A year after that first night, at the building's grand opening, surrounded by a crowd of nearly 150 people, caterers moving quietly between clusters of conversation, Vivian took my hand in public for the very first time. Not for 40 minutes, not for anyone watching, just because, in that moment, she genuinely wanted to. I remember the smell of fresh paint still lingering faintly in the air of that new building, sunlight pouring warm and golden through the tall glass windows I had designed with my own hands, and the soft sound of applause rippling through the room when Whitfield, who had become something like a real friend to both of us by then, raised his glass and told the entire room that we were the sweetest lie he had ever been genuinely happy to be told. I stood there in the middle of that crowd, watching her greet people she had known her entire professional life, and I thought about how far removed this moment was from the one where her fingers first closed around my wrist in a panic. There was no urgency in her now, no need to convince anyone of anything. She simply reached for my hand the way you reach for something familiar, something you no longer have to think twice about, and the ease of it said more than any speech Whitfield could have given that night. Vivian and I laughed together, easily, for what felt like the very first time without either of us quietly performing something for someone else's benefit. Somewhere in the middle of that year, I simply stopped counting minutes altogether. With Vivian, time was no longer something that had to be limited or measured out carefully or watched like it might run out on us. It had simply become something we shared, one ordinary day quietly following the next, with no clock running anywhere in the background. There were quiet Sunday mornings where she fell asleep on my couch with a half-finished cup of coffee going cold beside her, and I would sit there for a long while just watching her breathe, thinking about how strange it was that a lie told at a party had somehow turned into the truest thing I had ever lived. There were evenings at the harbor when neither of us said much of anything, and it never once felt like something was missing. I started noticing, somewhere around that first year, how differently I thought about my own house, the same brick walls and stubborn hinges I had spent 3 years fixing alone after my divorce. It no longer felt like a place I was hiding inside of. It felt, for the first time in a long while, like a place I actually wanted someone else to walk through the door of. Vivian never asked to move anything of hers in permanently, and I never asked her to, but somehow her coat ended up on the same hook by the door most weeks anyway, and neither of us ever mentioned it, because mentioning it would have meant treating it like a decision instead of what it actually was, which was simply the natural direction two people drift in when nothing false is standing between them anymore. I still keep that silver pocket watch in the top drawer of my desk, and every so often I take it out just to look at the old inscription, worn soft by someone else's hands long before it ever found its way into mine. I understand now what I did not understand that very first night. I thought, at the time, that I was simply playing a part for 40 minutes. In truth, those were the first 40 minutes I had been fully myself in longer than I could clearly remember. Not the failed husband, not the man quietly running from his own life, just someone who was needed, honestly and completely, by a person who genuinely meant it. I have learned in the time since that sometimes the smallest lie a person tells can quietly open the door to the largest truth they will ever end up telling. There are 40 minutes that change everything in a single evening, and there are 40 minutes that come to define an entire life stretched out afterward. I was lucky enough to live through both of those, with the very same person standing beside me the whole time. If someone grabbed your hand right now, in the middle of a crowded room, and asked you to pretend for 40 minutes, would you actually say yes? And honestly, how many of the things people tell you are just about work, do you think, are really just an excuse for something they are too afraid to say out loud? If this story reached you tonight, do not forget to like it, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Tell me honestly, what would you have done in my place that night?